So your new novel, A Free State, is about an escaped slave set in 1855 who flees a plantation in Virginia where, and he heads north. He's a banjo player. He's a very talented banjo player, and he ends up in Philadelphia. And there he ends up being persuaded to join a blackface minstrel group. It's not your normal adultery in the suburbs kind of novel. Could you talk about your inspiration, how this book came about?
Sure. You can hear me if I just speak in a normal voice like this? Good. All right. Thank you. By the way, thank you all for coming out. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to see everybody here. This book got underway a few years, before I really knew it was underway, I guess, a few years ago. I was friends with a great musician named Mike Seeger, who was one of the sort of seminal musicians in the so-called folk revival of the 1960s, Pete Seeger's half-brother. And after Mike died, I came into possession of one of his instruments. It was an open-back banjo. And I had never played banjo before. I didn't really know what to do with it, but this was an extraordinary thing to come into possession of, so I decided I needed to learn something about it. So I started learning to play open-back banjo, and I started reading about it also. And you can't read very far in the history of banjo without running into two huge and inescapable facts, or groupings of facts. One is the history of chattel slavery in the United States. The banjo, in its earliest form, was brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans in a kind of a rudimentary form, but became probably the most common instrument that enslaved people would play, because they were fairly easy to make in this early form. You took a gourd and sliced a side off of it and put a skin over it and put some kind of rudimentary neck on it, and you had an instrument that you could play. So one encountered very quickly the history of slavery and the relationship of this instrument to the lives of enslaved people. But you also run into a phenomenon that's at least as puzzling and strange as the peculiar institution of slavery, and that is the phenomenon of the blackface minstrel show in the 19th century. At the exact same time that the debate in this nation over the future of slavery and whether we were going to continue to have slavery was coming to a boil, the most popular form of entertainment in the country was this extraordinary institution of white men smearing burnt cork on their faces and performing a highly stylized, usually viciously racist and caricatured, and yet also very oddly somehow admiring, in a very weird backhanded way, kind of caricature of African American musical performance. And very often the tunes that they played, the songs that they learned, had been learned from slaves. But the music they played was also a hash of African American music, Irish fiddle tunes, everything. So it was really the beginning of American popular music, where you had a fusion of African American idiomatic expression with European forms. And it was popular beyond any measure. It was really and truly the rock and roll of the mid-19th century. And of course it continued on well into the 20th century, I just had a conversation with a bookseller in Alabama a couple days ago who told me that he, in high school, was performing in minstrel shows, blackface minstrel shows. Wow. So it was an extraordinarily persistent phenomenon. In any case, that moment of the coexistence of this national dream life, in a sense, of entertainment, of white men impersonating African Americans, and usually in a kind of happy black people on the farm acting foolishly, this kind of projection of this idea of happy slaves at the same exact moment, and again, it was a sensation, at exactly the same moment that you had this debate over slavery was just incredibly interesting to me. The actual specific gestation of the book was slave owners would very often put ads out, flyers, advertisements in newspapers, what have you, for escaped property. And these ads would always have descriptions of the runaway, 5'7", has a scar over here, kind of stocky, talks slow but thinks fast, whatever. And I saw this one ad that said, for this one escapee, said, very proficient on the banjar, which is an early variant spelling of banjo, and likely to have one with him. And I remember I read that and I thought, my God, what a situation.
Mm-hmm.
You have this guy who has the courage and the spirit and whatever else goes into the mix of going through all the risks of trying to get free. And he has this instrument that's a sort of vehicle for self-expression and being in the world and enjoyment and sense of expression of sense of life, plus also, doubtless, a means of making money. And yet this thing that is his greatest strength becomes this kind of crosshairs on his back, or a target on his back. So his greatest strength was his greatest vulnerability, ultimately.
And is that how Henry was born?
And that's how Henry was born.
And so once you...
Although I didn't know it yet.
You didn't. And once you embarked on this course of pursuing this idea for a novel, you must have had to do a lot of additional research. There's a lot of information in the book about the history of the American theater and performance, the history of the city of Philadelphia, and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Did it take you a long time?
It took, I was working on the book. I'm sorry, I just saw one of my heroes here who's one of the greatest banjo players. I'm sorry, Tony, I don't mean to blow your cover. But Tony Trishka is here. I wish you'd give him a round. He's one of the greatest banjo players who's ever lived. If I didn't actually introduce him, I would have been stuttering for the next 10 minutes, so I had to get that out of my system. Thank you for coming, Tony. Yeah, once this idea for the novel began to really take shape, I actually had the entire story very quickly in conversation. It was a result of, I had been working on another novel, and for a series of reasons, I ended up, this one began to come to the fore.
Right.
But as you say, yes, when you set a book in 1855, there's a lot of research that you do have to do. And I read a lot about, as you say, the history of Philadelphia, the history of theatrical performance in the 19th century, certainly a lot about slavery. There's a wonderful book that was written by John Hope Franklin, the great historian, called Runaway Slaves, which was a tremendous source of information and insight into the situation that enslaved people were in. A lot of stuff like that. The thing is, though, I had never done a book that required that kind of research. And the trick trick is the wrong word, of course, but the challenge, I guess, when you're writing a novel that has a large historical component is you can't allow, you can't fall so in love with the research that the research begins to sit very heavily on the material and sink it. In other words, the research is there to float the material, to float the imaginative act, not the other way around, and you can sort of smell it in a book if the research has become the thing that's actually driving the book, You have conversations like, well, as you know, John, when we first met 10 minutes ago, you said to me, a lot of exposition and dialogue, you have a lot of facts that come kind of uninvited to what's actually going on. The same way you live in New York and you don't go to the Empire State Building, or you don't go to the Statue of Liberty, characters are not really always constantly aware of all the things that you're aware of from doing your research. So you have to, in a way, kind of inhale all this material and become comfortable with it, and then exhale it all and just leave what is accessible to the consciousness of the characters and appropriate to the story.
Was there anything you discovered while you were doing the research that provided like a insider spark, that like the initial spark that brought the book into being. I'm thinking in particular of the final scene in the book, and I don't want to go into too much detail because for me it's the most remarkable scene in the book, but did you read about that character at the...
I visited that character's house.
You did. And
actually, with Mary. We were... I hate to be coy. This is we're almost forcing ourselves to be coy, and I don't want to tell you about it.
the significant historical figure, and really the only
It's not
significant...
Abraham Lincoln,
Yes.
no one.
And really the only significant historical figure who's in the book, right? Most of the other
I guess that's true,
characters
yeah.
are fictional characters that you created.
Yeah, I don't know where that scene came from. It's one of the, you know, it's funny, I had a conversation with my editor, Cal Morgan, who's here tonight, who's, I don't know what I would have done in life if Cal and I had never crossed paths. This is, we were talking upstairs, we realized this was our 7th book together. But we were talking, and right after I gave him the book, and he called me on the phone and telling me how much he liked the book, and I was kind of flustered when I finished the book because it was a very mysterious process writing this book. A lot of it, I had in mind a very different book than the one that I ended up writing. I thought I was going to write a grand Tolstoyan, 600-page, third-person omniscient, sprawling narrative of the 19th century, and I ended up writing this very short, compressed, imagistic. I don't know how this happened, but at every point where I tried to steer the book to conform to the template that I had generated initially, the book would just sort of sit down in the middle of the road and go, no. I was, come on, man, come on, we gotta get done, we got a deadline, man. The book was, it's actually no. So finally I would just have to kind of say, okay, so well, what do you want to do? I say, and the book would start going over here, and I'd have to follow it. So it was a very strange, it sounds like such an authorial conceit to say the material had a mind of its own, but in almost a literal sense, I felt that this material had a mind of its own. And so when I told Cal about this, Cal kind of basically said, "Oh, bosh, so what are you talking about? The craftsmanship involved." Blah. I said, "You accrue some craft over the years. I've been doing it for a while, but this book was a mysterious, strange process. One of the strangest.
More mysterious than previous books.
Oh,
in that
yeah.
regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's always mysterious. You're never really, you're never absolutely sure where things come from. Sometimes it's like a dream. You can say, well, I had this dream, and my grandmother was dressed like FDR, and she had just passed, the NRA, and then she was in a rocket ship, and she was making tuna sandwiches, and you're like, where the hell did all this come from? And you can say, well, I ate a tuna sandwich for lunch, and we just read it, we saw a show on FDR, but that doesn't really explain why the dream is structured that way. And so the logic of the thing is obviously asserting itself independent of your, conscious volition.
Well, and I wonder if part of it, at least perhaps subconsciously, was the relevant of the themes of this novel to what's going on in the culture right now. I mean, were you aware of that? Was that part of what drew you into this material? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't really say it was part of what drew me into the material. No, because first of all, I began the book, well before Charleston, well before Ferguson. I mean, not well before a whole lot of stuff, of which, of course, we're all aware if we're awake, and which I'm very aware of, and which I think about a lot. And certainly being in New Orleans, with the various vicissitudes of the police department and the jail and the socioeconomic realities of the town, I resonate with a lot of questions and issues around race, and but no, I didn't think, oh boy, Ferguson just happened, let me write a book about a runaway slave, and this will be my commentary on contemporary life. I don't think that's a good way to write a book. No.
Yeah.
So having introduced the themes to the book, would you like to read a little bit from it?
I could
Perhaps.
do that. Actually, can you reach that hardcover back there? Because there were certain crucial edits made, so I don't want to read from the galley. Let's see. Well, you know, maybe we're talking in such abstract terms right now about the book. Maybe what I'll do is read a passage of actual dialogue, an actual scene between a couple characters to give you a sense of maybe what some of that kind of dynamic of the book is. Listen, just so that you have some sense of how the book is put together, I would say that, excuse me, the book is told from a couple different standpoints. But it really opens up, it really first really opens up in the voice of a professional white blackface minstrel who is in charge of a very popular troupe in Philadelphia. The action is in 1855. So it begins he tells you sort of about the history of his life and how he came to be a minstrel and what interested him in it. But at the time that this book commences, his troupe is foundering a bit because minstrelsy has become so popular at that juncture, right around the middle of the century, that probably at that time there must have been 20, 30, maybe more troops in Philadelphia, just in Philadelphia. And it was a national craze. The nation wasn't quite as big, but all through, in the north, certainly. So this guy who's in charge of this troupe needs something new for his troupe to differentiate it from other troupes. And at that time in the history of minstrelsy, blackface minstrel troupes were starting to incorporate all kinds of extraneous elements. They would have Swiss bell ringers. They would have alpine yodelers in blackface. They would have Shakespearean parodies. They would have operatic pastiches. They would have scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right? So they were trying anything that could work to get market share or audience share. Right? So our guy here, the narrator, sees our other main character in the book, Henry Sims, who's the escaped slave, performing on the street. And he sees him once and he thinks, that's what we need, but Henry kind of scoots off into the crowd and gets away before he can talk to him. What I'm going to read you now is the scene where James Douglas, who's the minstrel, sees Henry for a second time and engages him in conversation and proposes that Henry come to perform with the troupe. And the other thing is you have to know is this would have sounded like a very outlandish proposal to Henry, our runaway, because you couldn't have black people performing with white people on stage at that time, even in Philadelphia.
It was illegal, right? It was
I think it was technically illegal in Philadelphia. So that's the sort of mise en scène here. So let me find this. All right. Okay. All right, this should take about 8 minutes. All right, so this is James talking to us, the minstrel, talking about Henry. And I should say that James decided to become a minstrel because he saw, as a young boy, he saw the legendary figure Joel Walker Sweeney, who was one of the pioneering blackface, and by the way, he is a real historical figure, saw him perform in a tent show and had his imagination fired up because he lived in a very kind of humdrum workaday life on a farm in Pennsylvania, and he just wanted, like Huckleberry Finn, just wanted to go somewhere. But anyway, so Henry disappeared that afternoon. This is referring to the first time he saw him. As described, but he lodged in my mind. In those few minutes, he summoned up for me the same sense of joy mixed with pathos, of humor, and of possibility that I had felt seeing Sweeney in the tent. Yet here was no impersonation, no masquerade. He was the thing itself. I did not know his name then, nor anything about him, but it struck me that if there were some way of presenting him in the show, he might add exactly the element that was being diluted. There was one drawback, of course. He was a Negro. And by the way, in this book, I have to use a lot of language that you would never, ever use if you're a decent human being today. But you can't write a book about this period without using these signifiers or designators. Negroes did not appear on stage at that time unless perhaps at some abolitionist meeting. To have a Negro appearing with a white troupe was unheard of, for that matter against the law. Presenting him could easily get us closed down. One would have to think of some subterfuge if one were even to attempt it in the first place. There was also the question of my partner, who was a banjoist named Mulligan, who was nothing if not proud of his own abilities on the banjo. In any case, before any of that, I would need to find him again. I finally saw him some weeks later playing outside the Black Horse Tavern. A crowd spilled out from under the awning that overhung the sidewalk, and two boys had climbed into the branches of an oak tree in the little park across the street in order to have a view. I was determined not to let my attention be distracted, even if a building were to collapse behind me. This time I would talk to him. I approached the crowd's edge and stood on my toes to see. He leaned against the wall in the shade and wore an expression of grave and comic unconcern as he played and sang, "Said the blackbird to the crane, when do you think we'll have some rain? The pond's so muddy and the creek's so dry, wasn't for the tadpole we'd all die." He ran through several songs, Mary Blaine, Dan Tucker, and one or two others from the familiar repertoire. His singing voice was better even than I remembered. It alighted on syllables and bent them downward as an ornament might bow a tree branch, and he endowed unexpected words with a sparkling glow. His banjo playing was full of trapdoors and tunnels. It galloped, jumped and turned, stopped and doubled back. He had a number of songs with lyrics I had never heard, which seemed to carry a veiled significance. One went, "My old mistress had a dog, blind as he could be. Every night around supper time, that old dog could see. My old mistress had a cow. I know the day she was born. Took that old jaybird 13 years to fly from horn to horn." In between songs, tuning his banjo, he seemed to register my presence, fleeting, but I thought I saw him mark me. Was it possible that he remembered my face from the previous occasion? All the while he kept up a line of patter, full of teasing and possibility, personalities assumed for 30 seconds and abandoned for others. "And now a song from my native land, Spain!" General hilarity as he looked around in feigned affront. "¿Qué pasó?" he exclaimed. "Pues no encuentro la maquineta de todos los postales y cuatro ramitos enchiladas," and so on. A fusillade of iridescent gibberish, pidgin Spanish that sent the crowd, myself included, into spasms of laughter. Plucking the strings in a deliberate habanera rhythm, he commenced singing, "Soft o'er the fountain, lingering falls the southern moon. Far over the mountain, breaks the day too soon." And everyone quieted down, entered the dream of the far-off border town, the doomed romance. It was extraordinary. At one point, I had to shake my head and look down at the cobblestones with their mottled gray surface, the stains from the wine cellars, and scuff my shoe back and forth to remind myself that there was a physical world outside the imaginary one he was summoning. He finished and announced that he would take up collection. I kept my eyes on him as I made my way through the other listeners. When I was near enough to be certain I would not lose track of him, I hung back and waited for the last of his subscribers to make their donations, and then I approached. He was replacing his banjo in a canvas carrying sack as I drew near. I had the sense that he was aware of my hovering, although he gave no acknowledgement. Behind him, the outline of the bricks on the side of the Black Horse Tavern were visible through a freshly painted advertisement for Bigelow's Bitters with its smiling monkey. I was aware of a cart passing behind me, the mule's hooves making a sound like Powell clopping his coconut shells. I waited for him to acknowledge me, but he didn't. Finally, he hefted his banjo in its sack and turned as if to leave, and I called out, "Hello!" At this, he stopped and turned to regard me. Although we were the same height and size, he gave the impression of looking at me from above. He said nothing. "May I speak with you for a moment?" I said. "You are speaking," he said. "Of course," I said, "but please, may I buy you a pint inside?" "I'm comfortable here," he said. "What do you want?" His face and the backs of his hands were the color of copper, and his eyes were green, with long lashes. With a little art, he might almost have been able to pass for a white man, a Spaniard, or certainly a Hindu at the least. I introduced myself and rushed into a confused oration about my admiration for his skills. As I spoke, He glanced past me and around us, at the activity behind me on the street, and then back at me. I watched him measure my mode and quality of dress, the degree of animation in my face, my way of placing myself even on the sidewalk, and I saw him come to the end of what he could discover as I continued chattering about his banjo prowess and command as a performer. I had the distinct sense that I was quickly running through my allotment of his available attention. When finally I remembered to mention that I was a founder of and performer with the Virginia Harmonists, he stepped into the middle of my words and said, "Are you from Virginia?" "Well, no," I said, "it's only the name we chose." I noted some small but distinct retraction in him. "What, by the way, is your name?" "Ham Peggotty," he said. No Dickens fans in the house. All right. I gave an involuntary laugh at the absurdity of this. This was nobody's name. God only knew where he had picked that up. "That is not your name," I said. "Is there anything else?" he said, as if to bring our interview to a conclusion. "Well, yes," I said, feeling a bit impatient now. I was, in fact, irritated. I had just strewn superlatives around him like rose petals, and he was being incourteous, to say the least. "I would like to talk to you about the possibility of incorporating you into our performance in some way." Now it was his turn to register my absurdity. He smiled for the first time, but more in mockery than in mirth. Once again he glanced around the streets quickly. "I'm not disturbing the peace," he said. "I am a free man and I'll defend myself." "What do you mean?" I said. He began backing away, keeping me in view. "Wait," I said, "what is wrong with you? I have a proposition for you." He stopped 10 yards away by the entrance to the alley behind the Black Horse. I watched him look down the alley, make some signal with his hand, nod, and then turn back to me. "State it quickly," he said. "I would like to find a way of using your talents in our show," I repeated. "We perform every night but Sunday at Barton's Minstrel Theater on Art Street. You can see for yourself if you don't believe me." "I have seen the handbills." "Well, then, how do you propose to present me on a stage in Philadelphia? You would be shut down." "I do not know yet." He regarded me for a long moment, looked up and down the street again. "What position do you play in the line?" He said, "I'm on the end with the bones. I can also play the banjo and the tambourine. You would not want to hear me play the fiddle, I'll promise you that." "Walk down there," he said, indicating a dock area on the river a block and a half away. "I will follow you and we can talk there. Don't turn around." Half certain that he would take the opportunity to run away while my back was turned, but with little choice except to do as he directed, I began walking in the direction he indicated. He was as skittish as a bird on a low branch. I was, of course, aware that Negroes were often prey to unscrupulous schemes, and my proposition must have sounded unlikely to him, yet I would have thought my sincerity was evident. I arrived at more or less the intended place and stood for a few moments looking at the river. Half a block away, some dock boys were hefting boxes onto a flatboat. I heard no footsteps, received no signal, and finally I turned around to look up the street. He was nowhere in sight. Once again, he seemed to have vanished into the ether. Well, I thought, I was right about that surmise at least. I was about to leave when I saw a movement behind some crates half a block away, and he emerged, looking once more up toward the top of Chestnut Street. He pointed to a low platform nearby as he approached and said, "We can sit there." "Is all this necessary?" I said. Half amused, half annoyed. "Do I seem so threatening?" He didn't answer. I saw that he was holding something in his hand, which he now held out to me. It was a set of bones. I took them from him as he pulled something out of a trouser pocket with a rustling of paper. "I hope you don't mind if I eat," he said, unwrapping a bun. "Play something for me." I remarked to myself that although I was the one with the famous troupe, the accolades, the theater, I had somehow found myself in the position of being auditioned by him. Anchoring the slightly bent lengths of white bone, about the size and shape of the doctor's tongue depressor, in my right hand on either side of my middle finger, I began with the necessary abrupt twistings of my wrist to set up the rhythmic pattern of De Boatman dance. The bones chattering mimicked the ornamentations and arabesques of a fiddle making its way through the melody. I played the three-part tune through twice as he munched on his bun, watching me and emitting a periodic "huh" if he heard something worth grunting about. He finished the bun at about the same time as I completed my audition, and he wiped his mouth with evident satisfaction. You know, he said, extending his hand to reclaim the bones, in the third part you can decorate the long notes this way. Taking the bones, he demonstrated an effect that with a minimum of apparent effort extracted multiple clacks for each turn of the hand. I watched closely, but I couldn't see how he did it. He slowed down to half speed, and still I could not make it out. He was watching me as I watched his hands. Finished, he replaced the bones in a small pocket sewn onto the side of his banjo sack. What do you want with me? I outlined in general terms that which I had in mind, my feeling about all the extraneous elements that were being added to the central part of the minstrel show, which central part was the Negro dimension. Glass harmonica players, operatic pastiches. As I spoke, I got more passionate. I told him about seeing Sweeney and the other minstrels, the pioneers of blackface. I told him of the exhilaration of hearing the music, playing it, and above all, the feeling of freedom that had come from blacking up. When I first heard the minstrels, I said, I felt as if I had been freed from a life of oppressive servitude. I suppose I conceived that this was all a kind of tribute to him and his race. Yet he was watching me with a face that might have defined irony. I stopped speaking. Have I said something wrong? With a look half amused and half derisive, he said, your eloquence is admirable. Will you come to the theater sometime and have a look? You can enter with me, and I can install you in the audience, and afterward, perhaps we can work something up. You may have an idea, and I may have one. Do you propose to pay me? He said. I will pay you out of my own pocket if need be. I watched him register this. Will you come then? He stood, hefted his banjo in its sack, and said, I'll have to see if I'm free. Wait, I said, will you tell me your real name? Henry Sims. He said this in his Spanish voice so that the surname sounded like seams. Where may I find you? Can we discuss this further? You found me twice, he said. Then he walked away, leaving me puzzled and with the distinct feeling that I might never see him again.